Let me begin by creating a context for this report. Where does it come from? As all of you probably know, the report that we anticipate from the UN Human Rights Council was based on a resolution that created what was once called the Shabbos Commission. And that resolution contained fundamental problems that caused Israel to oppose the mandate of the UN Human Rights Council. Those problems were apparent if anybody just goes over the language of what that resolution was. You might remember it was adopted in July 2014, right after Operation Protective Edge. What struck me about that original resolution and the mandate that it created was that in creating a commission of inquiry by the UN, it already in the mandate that it outlined concluded what the commission would produce. You look clause after clause, and I'll just read one of them. Condemns in the strongest terms the widespread, systematic, and gross violations of international human rights and fundamental freedoms arising from the Israeli military operations carried out in the occupied Palestinian territory since the 13th of June 2014. I won't go into their nomenclature, but clearly if you establish already what are the conclusions of any commission of inquiry, in the actual resolution that creates it, you have a fundamental problem here. And that's the reason why Israel decided not to cooperate with the UN Human Rights Council Commission and with its work over time. But where did that leave us? What are we supposed to do? Stay silent? So Israel created its own body, its own commission of inquiry, and it just so happens that in the last few days its work came to an end. And that's what we have here. The 2014 Gaza Conflict, 7 July, 26 August 2014, factual and legal aspects. So we needed to put forward our story because, as the Deputy Foreign Minister said, we had nothing to hide. Now this work is really the product of a serious interagency effort led by the Prime Minister's Office, the Foreign Ministry, the National Security Council, the IDF, and, of course, the Ministry of Justice. And therefore, what you have, and indeed our Deputy Foreign Minister made this point, what you have is a highly professional report with considerable information. You don't just make assertions about how Israel did the right thing. You have to prove it. And that's what this report does. Now, there are two stories in this report when you sit down and you go through it. The first part of it is the story of Hamas. And the second part of it is the story of the IDF. And we don't compare them. But the problem is the facts and the legal understanding of what happened are distorted in these two respects, both with respect to what Hamas did and what the undertakings of the IDF during the war. The most blatant aspect of Hamas activity was its decision, was its, I would call, defining quality of ignoring the most fundamental principle of the law of armed conflict by failing to adhere to the principle of distinction as it launched its campaign. As you know, that is probably the underlying principle of the laws of war, drawing a distinction between civilians and the military. And Hamas deliberately, intentionally attacked Israeli civilians as part of its modus operandi. But that isn't all that it did. For those acts themselves constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. Hamas embedded its own military capability in the heart of Palestinian civilian centers. And as such, not only threatened our civilians, but exposed its civilians to the brunt of this war. There's something else that needs to be emphasized when we look at how Hamas conducted military operations. Throughout the war, you'll find there are multiple ceasefire proposals that were given to both sides. The most important ceasefire proposal was given by Egypt with the backing of the Arab League on the 15th of July in the middle of the war. And what is striking, of course, is that had Hamas agreed to that July 15th ceasefire, which of course Israel agreed with, Israel was prepared to adhere to, then perhaps 90% of the casualties which Hamas suffered would not have occurred, which the Palestinians in Gaza suffered. So Hamas is responsible, directly responsible, for a high portion of the civilian losses in this conflict. Now, you know, there is that logic that sometimes occurs in political discussions. If you violate international law and the laws of war, why can't I? Well, that is not how Israel operates, because no matter how horribly Hamas conducted itself, the IDF adhered to the laws of armed conflict in some ways that were surprising. Everyone knows about the warnings, that we established a whole unit. We did that in previous conflicts before in Gaza, and that unit gave warnings to the population in multiple ways. Warnings by leaflet, warnings by breaking into Hamas radio broadcasts, and warning specific areas that Israel was going to move. And finally, the most important of the warnings were warnings to personal telephones and cell phones by a special unit of the army. That means we created, or we devoted resources of Arabic-speaking soldiers to reach the Palestinian population and to try and avert as much as possible casualties. Now, in many cases, the actions Israel undertook, went beyond what was required under international law. And Israel would decide not to attack a certain area, even though it was a legal action that it could undertake, simply because it was concerned about civilian losses. The whole notion of the knock on the roof, which is a precautionary measure that Israel undertook, is not something that's required under the laws of war, but Israel did that, especially when a UAV would be over a building and see that in response to a warning received by telephone, the population inside didn't leave. And I think finally, in terms of Israeli actions, what I think is striking is the considerable humanitarian effort Israel undertook in the midst of a war. You don't find that in other places. I want to close with an observation that struck me from the report. And if you are looking at the complete report, I would direct you to page 153. One of the things that happens in wars of this sort is that the IDF captures large amounts of Hamas material in Arabic and reviews it. And there is one case that stood out to me because of the power of the quote that appears on page 153. And if you'll excuse me, I'll read it to you. The IDF captured military doctrinal guidelines for the Hamas soldiers. And one of them, translated from Arabic to English, reads as follows: "The soldiers and commanders of the enemy must limit their use of weapons and tactics that lead to the harm and unnecessary loss of people and civilian facilities. It is difficult for the enemy to get the most use out of its firearms, especially of supporting fire in some areas." Now, what is the double meaning contained in that paragraph? The first meaning is that Hamas was aware that Israel abided by the laws of armed conflict. They know it. They don't have to attend a lecture like this to figure that out. They know it. And they put it in their training manual. And the second element that's contained in that quote is that Hamas exploits Israel's humanitarian instinct in order to gain a military advantage. And to me, that's the story of the war. A society committed to humanitarian values, fighting a national movement, a religious movement called Hamas, which doesn't care about basic humanitarian values the same way we do. It puts Israeli soldiers in a very tough position. We have legal oversight over our military operations in ways that other countries don't, including the involvement of the Israeli Supreme Court. And while wars are horrible, wars are something that leave people scarred, families have losses. If there is a little silver lining in the midst of all of this, it is the pride which the people of Israel should take in the efforts of the IDF to wage a legal war and to be consistent with the values upon which Israel was founded. I'll turn the floor over to our professionals who are involved in writing this report, and you can ask questions to them or to us subsequently.